I'm here to talk about the role of prisons. And, hello? Oh, the role of prisons. And the only way we can look at the role of prisons today is that we have to, like with everything, we have to start with a historical perspective. You know, we have to come at it from where it came from, you know, which is something that conservatives don't do. They never look at history, you know, because each day is the beginning for them. Historically, prisons were used to control labor, you know. And I'm not going to go back to the breakup of feudalism and the advent of capitalism, and, you know, they pushed all the peasants off the land, etc. But here, I want to start with the slave trade. People call it the slave trade, and at one time I had an insight. And the slave trade, it wasn't really an accurate description of what took place in Africa, on the shores of Africa, what took place on those ships. They weren't slaves, they were prisoners. They were first captured in Africa, on the continent of Africa. They were taken to jails on the shores of Africa, and then they were put on transportation, which you would call them prison ships instead of slave ships. And then they were brought to the New World, and they were put in pens where they were traded off and sold. And then they became slaves on those plantations. And the plantations were nothing more than prisons. It wasn't places that you could come and go. They were controlled by the plantation owners, and it's equivalent of what we would call correction officers today. You know, the plantations were surrounded by poor whites, labor that couldn't get jobs because they couldn't compete with slave labor, which was the cheapest form of labor that you could get, right? And so historically, there was a system that was in place, and ultimately it accumulated over 4 million slaves, right? And then we had the Civil War, and suddenly we have 4 million slaves that are freed, and not because of any free the slave movements or the abolition movement. It had nothing to do with that. They were freed simply because it was in the interest of the North, who had won the war on the battlefield, not to lose it in Congress, because the South was better, more populated than the North, right? And so what they had won on the battlefield, they were standing in jeopardy of losing in the political process. So what they did, they freed the slaves. First of all, they freed the slaves to take away that power base, you know, that labor away from the South. And once they did that, no, it's not going to do it. You got to turn the clock off. You want me to do this? All right, so they freed the slaves to take that power away from the South, and then they gave them the right to vote because they knew they were going to vote with those that freed them. And so with every action, there's a reaction. And the pushback from the South was eventually to find a way when the plantation door closed, the prison doors opened wide. So now suddenly we got 4 million freed slaves that have no resources, that are poor, you know, penniless. And so they made laws like vagrancy and petty theft. And they took that and they began to fill the prisons with them, and then sell off their labor from prison. Okay, so we fast forward to the day, and we see that there's very little difference in what took place at the beginning of the slave trade during that period than what's taking place today. All we have to do is look at the poor communities of color, the Harlems of America, and see them as Africa, right? And what do we have? You know, they round them up, they hold them in the jails, they put them on buses, planes, and trains, and they move them out of their communities, and they move them into these new plantations that we call prisons. You know, and who is the population that they're targeting? They're targeting the populations that are surplus populations, surplus labor, throwaway people, social dynamite, the activists of the 60s and 70s. They filled up the prisons with them. And so these are the throwaway people, the expendable people, the surplus labor, and it's the same thing that they filled the prisons with after when they instituted, when they opened up the prison doors in 1865. We begin to open them up. So today, we have, according to Michelle Alexander, we have more black men under the control of the criminal justice system than we had in slavery in 1850. Huh? 1850 is 10 years before the Civil War. 10 years before the Civil War, we have more black males under the control of the criminal justice system. We got 2.4 million locked up in jails and prisons, and we got another 5 million under the control of the criminal justice system, either on probation, parole, or some other form of control. So what has really changed? Nothing has changed, man. Ultimately, we're right back where we're at, where we started. And based on present conditions and projections into the future, it's going to get worse because the American economy is busted. We don't produce anything in this country that's not produced by China, India, Brazil, or all the other emerging economies in the world. So what are our prospects? A continuation of this, right? So, okay, I'm going to finish. The impact of this has been, this has impacted our culture, our youth, and our communities. In terms of culture, we can take a black kid out of Harlem and drop him anywhere, any other community of color around this nation, and he'll fit right in. They wear the same clothes, they got their pants hanging off their ass, talking about, hey, look at me. They're walking down the street. And I mean, everything about them is a perfect fit. It's almost as if they all came to the Polo or the Yankee Stadium and they sat down and say, well, this is what we're going to be. We're going to be drug dealers, we're going to be gangbangers, whatever it is, right? And all of them look the same, they speak the same language. This is systemic. This is the culture. Our communities are just like all the other communities of poor people of color in this country. They turn them into open-air prisons. Everywhere we look in these communities, we see flashing lights. We see kids up against the wall. We see our rights being violated. We see the Oscar Grants being killed. It goes on all across America in communities of color. All right, the response to this, what has been the response to this? The response to this by our community of activists and service providers has been a form of boutique activism. Everybody comes and picks out a piece of the problem and they work on it. And ultimately it becomes just individual job programs. Because if you ask the average activist organization out here today in America, ask them what have they done to improve the conditions of prisoners and their families and the communities that they come from, you're going to get silence for the most part. And one exception I've found to that since I've been here is the anti-death penalty movement. You do have significant, concrete successes that you can point to. You manage to work and get people off of death row. So what is the future? The future is that we have to build mass movement. And on that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker so that they can address that question.